Hello, and welcome back to AOPA's Pilot Information Center live stream webinar series. Our topic for this evening is BasicMed, what it means for you. This webinar is brought to you by AOPA's Pilot Protection Services. For more information on how we can provide you with aviation, legal, and medical assistance, you can visit the website at www.aopa.org/pps. I'm Ferdi Mack with AOPA's Pilot Information Center here in Frederick, Maryland. Thanks for joining us. Joining me today are Gary Crump and Jared Allen. Gary is the Director of Medical Certification in our Pilot Information Center, and Jared is a Senior Attorney with our Pilot Protection Services. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ferdi.
Hey, Ferdi.
Thanks so much for being here with us.
Our pleasure.
So, Jared, let's get started. BasicMed, what it means for you. Let's start with some of the major topics we're going to cover this evening.
Absolutely. So, Ferdi, you know that Gary and I, like yourself in the Pilot Information Center, spend every day talking to members and answering their questions about BasicMed. And so what we're going to go over tonight is going to answer all those common questions, as well as a good overview of what the new BasicMed regulations in Part 68 require for pilots operating under BasicMed. And so we'll go over first a quick review about how we got to these new regulations, the history behind them. Then we'll go over the actual requirements of the regulations, including the types of aircraft that are included in BasicMed, the certain flight condition limitations that those aircraft must be operated under, and then we'll go over the eligibility requirements that the pilots operating under BasicMed must meet, as well as what they must do to maintain their qualifications. And then we'll also briefly review the requirements that the physicians who are going to be providing examinations to these pilots have to meet through the examination process. So with that, let's get started.
Great.
So, as many of us may remember, AOPA has been petitioning to reform the medical certification regulations since the late 1970s. Much more recently, in 2012, AOPA and EAA filed a joint petition to the FAA to allow pilots to operate with just a driver's license, and that would allow pilots to operate very limited types of aircraft under very limited conditions. So, for example, a single-engine aircraft, 180 horsepower, day VFR only, single passenger, very restrictive. And so that petition was filed. I think there was something like 16,000 comments received, and then the FAA just took forever and didn't really do anything with it, which leads us up to 2016 when you had the FAA Extension, Safety and Security Act of 2016. And when that was introduced, contained a section called Section 2307, medical certification of certain small aircraft pilots, which is a mouthful. But that was the federal law that actually required the FAA within 180 days to issue or revise regulations that actually implemented what this federal law set forth. And that law went through the House and Senate and was signed into law by the President on July 15th of 2016. And so from that date, the FAA had 180 days to actually issue or revise these regulations, which surprisingly they met. In January, I believe it was like the 10th, around the 11th, they actually published those regulations, creating a new Part 68 of the Federal Aviation Regulations that contained these implementing regulations. They also revised some sections in Part 61, some existing regulations to conform to these new requirements. But this new part contains all of the BasicMed requirements. Now, the important thing to remember, and we're going to be mentioning this a lot over the course of the presentation, is that these regulations don't take effect until May 1st. So they're published, they're out there, but not effective until...
Say that again, Jared.
Exactly, May 1st.
I want to do it sooner.
And wouldn't we all? But we have to wait. May 1st is the effective date. And so let's go over what those BasicMed regulations of Part 68 actually set forth. So the first biggest item is what aircraft can be operated by these BasicMed pilots, and the law refers to them as covered aircraft.
And I want to stop you right there.
Sure.
You didn't say airplane.
I didn't.
Aircraft.
Absolutely,
Big
because
difference.
as we'll see here, no limitations as to category or class. So it can be a single-engine aircraft, twin-engine aircraft, it can be a helicopter. That's a common, very common question. But really, you need to meet two requirements. And the first is that aircraft have a maximum certificated takeoff weight of no more than 6,000 pounds. So you've got to meet that requirement. And then the next requirement is that aircraft cannot be authorized under federal law to carry more than 6 occupants. And so in this context, authorized means either your type certificate, your amended type certificate, or your STC basically states that you cannot have more than 6 occupants in that aircraft. Now, we are aware of at least one model or make of aircraft, Piper Cherokee 6, that actually creates a little bit of an issue because that aircraft, if you look at its type certificate, has a provision for 6 or 7 seats or something along those lines. And so this aircraft has a removable seat, bolts in, bolts out. And even if that seat is removed and there's only actual 6 seats in the aircraft, it's still capable of carrying more than 6 occupants, or is authorized to carry more than 6. And so that's not a covered aircraft.
And that's not out of the realm of reasonable aircraft ownership either. That's actually one of the hot buttons that we've been getting in the PIC as far as owners who are asking that exact question. We probably hear it half a dozen times a week.
Right, and I'm sure there's going to be more aircraft that pop up that kind of fall into this gap. So it's really something that pilots need to watch out for. And so those are the 2 main issues, the maximum certificated takeoff weight of 6,000 pounds and no more than 6 occupants. And so let's talk about the flight condition limitations that those aircraft have to be operated under. And so we mentioned the 6 occupant requirement, but there's also a requirement that you have no more than 5 passengers. So in most cases, this is going to mean that there's a pilot and then 5 passengers, no more than 6 occupants. If you have an aircraft that requires 2 flight crew members, then you're going to have 2 pilots and 4 passengers. But any way you break it down, no more than the pilot and the 5 passengers if that's the case. The next requirements are not necessarily limitations to the aircraft, but just limitations for that flight. And so the first one is that the flight cannot be operated, or the aircraft cannot be operated during that flight at an airspeed more than 250 knots indicated airspeed. The aircraft can be capable of flight faster than that, but if you're flying under BasicMed, you've got to keep it at 250 or below. Same for the next requirement, up to 18,000 feet MSL. And so the aircraft can be capable of flying above 18,000 feet MSL, but for this flight, you've got to keep it at or below. The next requirement really isn't a limitation, but it's that you can operate these flights under BasicMed day, night, VFR, IFR, no restrictions. And so that's a great thing. I mean, that's more than what we asked for in 2012.
It's
so
fantastic.
It's a great thing. The next requirement is a big one. The flight cannot be for compensation or hire, and that includes carrying passengers or cargo for hire. It does allow flight instruction because the FAA takes the position that flight instructors are being paid for their instruction, not their pilot services. So CFIs are still good to go here.
That's probably one of the biggest surprises of the final rule announcement is that CFIs were going to be allowed to operate under BasicMed.
Absolutely, and it was a good outcome.
And some of those instructors we've spoken to have half the picture. They understand, yes, hooray, we can instruct, but gosh, no, we're not allowed to receive compensation. And luckily, we got the whole boat. We got the ability to instruct, and we got the ability to receive compensation as instructors.
Right, and another important thing to mention is that when you're talking about about BasicMed, it applies to the PIC. And so if you are the PIC of that aircraft, BasicMed is going to apply to you. So if you are, for example, operating as a required flight crew member, if, for example, as a safety pilot for someone flying under the hood for their IFR currency, BasicMed doesn't apply to you. You're not acting as the PIC in that situation, unless you are, in which case that creates more issues for that person under the hood. But in any event, think of it this way. If you're acting as PIC, then BasicMed is going to apply to you. So keep that in mind. And then the last limitation here is that the flight has to be completely within the United States. Now, for many of us, that's going to mean within the 48, lower 48, and then, or if you're operating completely within Hawaii or Alaska. But keep in mind that if you, for example, want to do a flight from the lower 48 to Alaska, you're going to leave U.S. airspace, and you're going to overfly Canada or international airspace. That's going to create a problem. You know, right now, Transport Canada has said we're not honoring BasicMed. We're working on having them change that opinion. But for now, only the United States recognizes it, and so you've got to keep that flight within the United States.
And we've already got a question on that topic. It reads, if we plan to fly to the Bahamas, does that mean that we must maintain a Class 3 or higher medical?
If you're going to be exiting U.S. airspace at any point of the flight, you're going to need to have that medical certificate, whether it's a third, second, first class, special issuance, what have you. But BasicMed is not going to apply for now. There is a provision that if the country that you're going to conduct the flight within completely authorizes it, you know, you're permitted, but to date, no other countries yet. So
and I think last summer at either Sun and Fun or Oshkosh, we were told that the Bahamian tourism people were already kind of getting on the bandwagon to support tourism in the Bahamas. Absolutely, it makes sense.
Certainly.
So they'll probably be the first.
Yeah.
Well,
hopefully others will follow suit.
I know that the AOPA government affairs folks are working on it, so we'll see what happens.
Jared, one question that I'm sure we're going to get once this kicks in, the question just regarding the maximum airspeed. The question is going to be, how is the FAA going to enforce that, and what's the likelihood of that happening?
Well, obviously we don't know because we haven't seen it happen
Right.
yet, of course, but radar data is the easiest explanation.
Right.
Now, we're also going to have ADSB.
Right.
And so that's going to be another way that, just like any other airspace incursion or violation they may want to prove, if they want to look at a pilot for not operating in compliance with BasicMed, you can expect them to look at that kind of data. Again, we'll see what happens.
It'd be kind of a random stop, though, because there's no data that's going to demonstrate that the pilot was flying under BasicMed.
Well, and I think that what we'll see is that if we have issues like that, it'll come up if there's another event involved. For
Right.
example, a pilot has a
Right.
deviation because they deviated from an altitude.
Right.
And the FAA says, oh, we're going to investigate this, and where is your medical certificate? Oh, you don't have one? How are you operating? And it goes from there.
Well, they've got the ticket book open.
Abso-
Well, I've got you
absolutely.
here.
Absolutely. So, since we're talking about the pilot, let's look at the BasicMed requirements for the pilot. And so, the first really basic requirement, basic, is that pilot hold a valid U.S. driver's license. And not only are they going to have to hold that driver's license, but they're also going to have to comply with any restrictions or limitations on that license. So for example, if the license requires that you carry corrective lenses, or you're not allowed to operate at night, those restrictions are going to carry over into your BasicMed flying. So you got to be observant about that.
Right.
And then the next basic eligibility requirement is that the pilot have held either a unrestricted, a regular medical certificate, or a special issuance medical certificate at some time since July 15, 2006. Now, they just have to have held it. It doesn't have to be issued after that date. It just has to have been held. So for some pilots who are age 40 or above or below, there may be some issues there since the regulations changed.
Right.
The best recommendation I have at this point is if you have questions about that, the FAA has a released advisory circular. It's called AC 68-1. On page 4.3, they have a very nice table in there to go through step by step to determine whether you meet the requirements for holding a medical certificate on July 15th, on or after July 15th of 2006. And so an additional requirement is that you have held a medical or special license within that time, and that your most recent certificate was not suspended or revoked. You did not complete an application and then withdraw it. You did not have a completed application denied, or you didn't have a special issuance authorization withdrawn. So for most pilots who are going to qualify for BasicMed, I'm going to think that a lot of them had a certificate sometime and then it just lapsed. Or if it was a special issuance, it expired.
Right.
So they do have to meet those basic eligibility requirements. And if by chance they don't, then the one caveat, of course, is that they're going to have to go back to an AME and get either a regular medical certificate or special issuance one time before they can then be eligible to operate under BasicMed. And so the FAA wants that one touch, and this is also going to apply to new pilots, guys who have never held a medical, guys or girls who have never held a medical.
Exactly. And the caveat to that caveat is that you want to make sure you're going to be issued a medical certificate if you fall in that category of having to get a one-time special issuance or a brand new pilot. So I'll just throw a little plug in for Pilot Protection Services right now and say that we have the opportunity to review medical records before you submit anything to the FAA in support of an application for a special issuance or a regular medical certificate. So you might want to keep that in mind if you're in that situation where you're going to have to go back and get a one-time kiss by the FAA before you can fly under BasicMed, because if you get denied, you can't even fly as a light sport pilot at that point.
Absolutely.
And it's not only that, it's even the more trivial circumstances. Again, maybe you're a younger person and you're looking to get into flying and obtain your first medical certificate. Maybe you have one or two minor conditions, maybe you're on a medication. Even then, it still benefits you to give us a call to run through, okay, I have a diagnosis of hypertension and I'm on this medication, and I have diet and exercise controlled diabetes. What does that mean to me? You need to know, you want to know, because as you said, you don't want to trigger jeopardy by going in the first time and getting denied, or or maybe sent to Oklahoma City for review, even, because you're going to not know what's going to happen unless you have us there to help inform you.
And since these new rules aren't effective until May 1st, that means that if anyone's out there with a certificate that expires before May 1st, you're either going to need to go and get another certificate if you need to operate in the meantime, or you're going to need to fly with another pilot who's qualified to act as PIC,
Right.
or you're going to need to sit and wait until these are effective. So that's maybe a consideration to keep in mind for those pilots out there who may be looking at an expiration or lapse date somewhere in April.
And we have probably already talked to every AOPA member whose medical certificate expires on April 30th. And that leads to the question about May 1st being the effective date, because, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the forms for the examination and the online course right now won't be available until May the 1st. So if you plan on flying on May the 1st, you're going to have to schedule your flight physical or your examination with your physician early in the morning, and then be able to get online and take the course in the afternoon or whenever, and still be able to fly on the first day that the rule is effective.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the FAA is not being very considerate of people's travel plans.
That they are not.
Something to keep in mind.
That they are not.
So since you mentioned the actual examination, let's take a look at the requirements for pilots to operate under BasicMed. And so the major two is that, number one, a pilot is going to need to take a medical examination checklist to a state licensed physician. And that checklist is going to contain a lot of the same questions that are very similar to the current medical application, the Form 8500. And the pilot is going to take that to a state licensed physician, which Gary will elaborate on what that means a little bit later on. But the physician will conduct a very simple examination. It's literally a checklist. They are going to be checking off that I've looked at ears, eyes, nose, throat, and then that doctor will sign a certification that they don't believe there's any conditions that would affect that individual's ability to safely operate an aircraft. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more later. But the pilots are going to need to have this examination completed initially, and then at least every 48 months moving on to remain qualified under BasicMed. The second requirement, which we'll elaborate more on later as well, is that there's going to be an online medical education course. AOPA is in the final stages of getting ours approved by the FAA. This medical education course is going to be available free online. It's going to be about 45 minutes to an hour. It'll elaborate on a lot of very relevant aeromedical decision making and information, prescription medications, certain conditions, and Gary will certainly review all those in a few moments. Once the pilot completes this course, they're going to get a certificate, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But again, this course is going to be required initially, and then every 24 calendar months moving forward for the pilots to be qualified under BasicMed.
Right.
So
Right.
I think that takes us to a little bit of the finer points. So why don't you tell us about that checklist?
Yeah, the Comprehensive Medical Examination Checklist, the acronym CMEC, FAA loves acronyms,
Absolutely.
is, you'll find it very similar to the current FAA Airman Medical Application.
Similar? Isn't that an understatement?
Well, ask Jared, and it's not 100% similar. There is one distinct difference. Jared, you want to
Yeah.
mention
There
what that
is, and it is worth mentioning because it may affect some airmen out there, and that is when the federal law was passed, they cited to an earlier version of the medical form, which I think changed around 2008. And the big difference airmen will see is that on question 18 on this checklist, it's going to ask about alcohol-related motor vehicle actions, but only about convictions. The current medical application asks about arrests and convictions, but because the law cites to this earlier version of the form that only talked about convictions, now this form is only going to talk about convictions. So that may change what these airmen are disclosing, because they may have been disclosing an arrest situation up until now.
Exactly.
And so that's something that, again, those situations can get rather complicated quickly, so we always recommend that they talk to someone who's familiar with this type of form and certification.
Definitely. So we're referencing the advisory circular. It is a tremendously helpful piece of information. So we'll talk about it probably several more times here throughout the webinar. But on the advisory circular, you can actually see a draft of the examination forms, and I emphasize draft because we've already had some members who downloaded them, printed them out, took them to their doctor, and they tried to get their exam done.
And some of the doctors actually
And
completed
some of the
it.
doctors actually completed it and signed it, so they got a little head start on the effective date of the rule. But it's a draft. You can't use it yet, but you can get an idea of what's going to be on the examination checklist. And again, you'll see it's very similar. If you've been applying for a third-class medical certificate for a long time, you're going to look at that and say, gosh, this looks really familiar. Yeah, it really will be familiar. The big difference is nothing as far as medical history is going to get transmitted to the FAA. This is between you and the state licensed physician who's going to be doing your examination and hopefully signing off the checklist that will take you one step closer to completing the online course, which will get you legal to fly under Basic Med. So you'll see questions about your medications usage. One important distinction now is that under a Part 67 third class medical certification, there are certain medications that the FAA really frowns upon and in some respects outright disallows for aviation activities. That's not going to be the same situation with Part 68, and it is a little bit delicate, but you're not going to be prohibited if you're on a medication that would be disqualifying for a Part 67 medical certificate. But you and your doctor are going to have a conversation about that and find out why you're taking that medication, and have you ever had any side effects from it, and is it appropriate and safe to use that medication while you're flying. So your other basic medical history, what illnesses have you had? Have you had any recent surgery, broken any bones, anything like that? So you're going to find it's really pretty similar to what you're already doing. Again, the big distinction is you're not going to be transmitting anything to the FAA, so it's not like a pass-fail. Even though you may be seeing your AME, who is going to be possibly the state licensed physicians that's going to be doing your examination. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the checklist itself. Once you have done your part, the front side, and you've had your conversation with your physician, then the physician has a signature block, and he or she's going to sign you off, and you're going to be on your way. The physician can be your AME, and I personally am hopeful that a lot of the AMEs who are now a little bit reticent about jumping onto this bandwagon with Basic Med, once they realize what the intent is and what their important role is, because the AMEs already are trained in aviation medicine, they have an existing relationship with their pilots and their state licensed physicians. So the AMEs in many respects would be the perfect candidates to do do the Basic Med physical.
Exactly. Why not make it a seamless transition for both the physician and the pilot, as opposed to disrupting both sides of the equation?
Right, right. The only concern I have about that is some AMEs may have a little bit of difficulty taking off their AOPA or their AME hats and putting on a treating physician hat, which is what's required under the Basic Med. But once we get past that hurdle, I think the AMEs are going to be a real integral part of the success of Basic Med.
And you mentioned the AMEs. Can you just give a quick overview about the other types of state licensed physicians that pilots can go to?
Absolutely. The advisory circular again provides some pretty broad guidance as to what constitutes a state licensed physician. Most of the time we think of an MD, a medical doctor, or a DO, a doctor of osteopathic medicine. But the guidelines in the advisory circular suggest that some states recognize other physicians other than MDs and DOs as state licensed physicians. So in some states, a dentist, a DDS, a doctor of dental surgery, would be recognized as a state licensed physician. So if that dentist, and dentists out there do have quite a bit of medical training in dental school, so they know physiology and anatomy. So they may be perfect candidates to serve as a Basic Med physician as well. We had a question about yesterday about a doctor of naturopathy, homeopathic doctor. Actually, I'd never heard of that before, but they're state licensed, so and these people are probably pretty well trained too. So if their state recognizes them as a state licensed physician, they may very well be qualified to do Basic Med. So there's a little wiggle room there.
Right. So the FAA is relying on that. Well, the FAA is relying on the state to say who's a state licensed physician, and then it's up to the physician as to whether they're comfortable.
Exactly.
To do it.
As well it should
Great.
be. As well it should be. Absolutely. So, in most cases, it may be your primary care physician. If you are already have a special issuance, say for insulin-treated diabetes, you're seeing an endocrinologist who is an MD. Probably, if you're on a special issuance, you're seeing that endocrinologist at least 4 times a year, quarterly. So that doctor may be perfectly happy and willing to serve as your Basic Med physician. That doctor's going to know you probably better than anybody else does. So whoever you're comfortable with, we're seeing now a big surge in the opening of urgent care centers around the country. And we just heard yesterday that we're going to start looking at the physicians that operate these urgent care centers, because they're located just about everywhere. They're almost as common as Walgreens and Rite Aids on the corner. But those physicians are already doing occupational medicine in some respects, over-the-road truckers and other types of certifications. So those the urgent care centers may be very viable opportunities for pilots to access a physician to do the certifications as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on. The doctor then will perform a basic physical examination. Again, it's, I can't say it's exactly like your AME does, because as many AMEs are out there, there are the same number of examination types based on who you're seeing. So I've been to AMEs that basically you fog the mirror and sign the check and you walk out the door with your medical. Others have been pretty thorough, comprehensive exams that cover all the elements of the examination that the FAA prescribes for AMEs. So the doctor will do that basic examination. He's going to check your eyes, ears, nose, lungs, abdomen, check your blood pressure, check your pulse rate, listen to your heart, see if you have any arrhythmias. A basic comprehensive medical examination. The human body doesn't change based on the content of the examination that's being done. So again, it's going to be real similar to a pretty comprehensive, thorough, third-class medical examination. Again, the important thing, it's not getting sent to the FAA.
And on that note, actually, we've had a couple questions. Once my physical is signed, is there any filing needed, or am I good to go? What do I have to do with that paperwork once I have it in my hands?
Sure. So we'll talk about this later on, but we can certainly address it now. And that is that, unlike the current medical application, this form, we presume the doctors want to retain a copy for their own records. But the form itself, the pilot's going to retain that. The federal law requires that they retain it with their logbook. Right. The FAA has elaborated that and said, look, you can keep it with your logbook or wherever you want to, or you can keep it in electronic format, right, as long as you can produce it either in electronic format or in paper form upon request by the FAA. And what that means is that just like with your pilot logbook, you're not going to be required to carry it with you while you're operating the aircraft, but you're going to need to make it available if the FAA does request it, and usually that means a reasonable request, so there is some time there.
Right.
So. Okay.
Good question.
Great.
So the doctor will then address any medical conditions that come up in the course of the examination. In some cases, that doctor may become your treating physician, because if he or she picks up, say, an abnormal pulse rate or a heart arrhythmia, or picks up something in your lungs, listening to your lungs, that doctor may want to send you out for additional testing, and depending upon the outcome of that test, may or may not choose to sign off on your basic med. So, we're going to get pilots to their physicians one way or the other. The big plus to basic med is that the fear about not being issued a medical certificate is going to go away, and hopefully pilots are going to be much more comfortable in going to their doctor when they have a problem. We talk to lots of members right now that really are hesitant to see their doctor because they're concerned about their medical more than they are their potential coronary artery disease. So that's a good outcome that's going to result from basic med. So again, they're going to talk about medications, and in the course, the online medical course, education course, we spend quite a bit of time on the medications section, because medications have different effects based on where you are atmospherically. You can take certain medications on the ground and have absolutely no problems. You get in an airplane, climb up to 6,000–7,000 feet after taking the same medication, and you may become symptomatic to the point where it could potentially adversely impact the safety of the flight. So you'll have that conversation with your physician. You'll talk about your medications, why you're taking those medications, what the dosages are. Have you ever had any problems with these medications as far as side effects? So you'll be pretty educated just in your conversation with your physician, and also by the time you've completed the online course, you're going to know more about the medications that you're taking. Special issuances. Special issuances are required for, under Part 67, the existing standards that we work with now, for 15 specific disqualifying medical conditions. Now, that doesn't mean that the FAA can't do special issuances for hundreds of other medical conditions, and they do that routinely. The 15 conditions are are codified into the regulation. They're right there for everybody to read. But the FAA has the discretion to do a special issuance for anything else, whether it's one of the 15 or not. Some of those conditions have carried over into the Part 68 Basic Med. So there are actually 11 medical conditions now that will require a one-time special issuance before you can legally fly under Basic Med. There are 4 cardiac conditions: heart attack, coronary artery disease that's been treated, valve replacement, and heart transplant or heart replacement. Personality disorders, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and substance dependence. And then under the neurologic conditions, epilepsy, a disturbance of consciousness without satisfactory medical explanation, and a transient loss of nervous system function without satisfactory explanation. Those conditions come directly verbatim right out of Part 67. There's a reason for that. These are the conditions that pose the greatest risk to the safety of the national airspace system. So that's why the FAA and just about all other ICAO civil aviation regulatory bodies pay a lot of attention to these medical conditions, particularly the mental health conditions in light of the German wings accident a few years ago. So everybody's eyes are on those conditions. So if you have never held a special issuance before and you have a history of one of these conditions, the FAA is going to get an opportunity to touch you one more time and make sure that you would qualify for a one-time special issuance. You get it, it expires after a year, and you're good to go under Basic Med from that point on. So the real beneficiaries, I think, of Basic Med are going to be those pilots that have been under a special issuance that in many cases costs a lot of money to maintain on an annual basis because of what the FAA requires in the way of recurrent testing that would not normally be required by their own treating physician.
Treadmill stress test comes to mind. We hear about that a lot.
Absolutely.
Maybe the FAA requires it on a higher frequency than the treating physician might, in which case that's uninsured, out-of-pocket expense in order to comply with the FAA's more frequent information gathering.
Exactly right. And with the stage of our healthcare coverage in this country, a lot of conditions that used to be picked up routinely with very little copay now are going to be purely out of pocket for pilots to maintain these special issuance. So the real people that are going to benefit are the folks that have been shelling out several $1,000s a year to maintain their medical certificate. And a lot of these pilots fly 50 hours a year, so they could have bought a lot of avgas and bought a lot of flight time for the cost of maintaining that special issuance. So that was one of the real driving factors in our initiative to get Basic Med through, is just the cost factor alone.
And not to mention obtaining the treadmill stress test data, for example, submitting it and waiting for it to be reviewed.
Exactly.
We talked to lots of pilots who were on effectively a one-year cycle because of the request for additional information every year, or every other year as it is, and then they've got a 3-month gap in that 12-month cycle, so they're only able to fly for 9 months out of the year anyway.
And since you brought it up, I don't feel so bad. But yeah, the FAA is not very efficient in processing any type of deferred medical, and right now you're going to wait probably 3 months, if not longer, for a renewal of a special issuance. And our argument all along, even back to the exemption petition in 2012, was that we felt that pilots were more likely to be a safety risk because they were not flying. They're losing their proficiency while they're waiting for their special issuance to come through. So more of a concern there than the condition that required their special issuance in the first place.
Right.
The other benefit on the special issuance thing for Basic Med is that there's not a mandatory wait or recovery and observation period like there is now, and that particularly applies to the cardiovascular conditions. If you've had a stent, you got to wait 3 months under Part 67 standards, 6 months if you've had coronary bypass surgery, but there's no mandatory wait period. So once your surgeon has cut you loose for normal activities,
no pun intended,
you can go apply for your special issuance medical certificate.
And Gary, you mentioned airmen who had a history that required them to get one of these special issuances. What if they had a regular medical, it lapsed, it expired, they get qualified through Basic Med, but then they develop one of these conditions?
Oh, yeah.
Are they going to be required to get one of these?
Once you've had that history, even after Basic Med kicks in, you've still got to go back and get a one-time special issuance. So yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sure, actually we haven't been asked that yet, but I bet it'll start coming up, so I'm glad that you brought it up. So if that history comes after the implementation date of Basic Med and you have one of those 11 conditions, you're going to have to go back and let the FAA touch you one more time. Yeah, good point. All right. If you have any type of medical condition that would be considered potentially negative as far as aviation safety, you're going to have to be seeing your treating physician on a more regular basis than the 48 months required by the rule. I personally feel that 48 months is a little too long between physical examinations.
Okay,
so I'm kind of a
right.
proponent. I'm gonna plug the docs here now. If anybody had asked me, I would have said, yeah, probably every 2 years would be a reasonable time frame. Hopefully, for pilots that are on special issuances now, you'll continue to see your specialist on a regular basis that's suggested by your treating physician,
Yeah.
rather than what the FAA requires. But yeah, if you're in good health, and most of us, I mean, we're an aging pilot population, so if you're probably over 50, an annual trip to your primary care doctor just for a good routine physical is probably a good idea. That's much more frequently than required by the regulations, but sometimes the regulations are they're
Right.
geared more for regulatory purposes.
Exactly.
than
I
they are
mean,
for
just like
safety.
under Part 67, what may be a good idea for a regulatory requirement doesn't necessarily translate into what you should be doing based on your particular health or
Exactly.
condition. So.
Exactly. Let's move on. You want to talk about what the doctor must do?
Certainly. So when the doctor goes through this checklist, they are going to have to examine all those items, basically affirm that they checked that ear, eyes, nose, throat, what have you. But then they're going to have to actually make a certification on this checklist that basically says that they discussed all the items on the checklist with the airmen, discussed the medications that could possibly interfere with their ability to operate an aircraft, and that they performed the examination that included all of these items. And so once they do that, there's another part that they're going to have to certify that they are not aware of any medical condition that, as presently treated, would affect the individual's ability to safely operate the aircraft. And we are putting out, or going to be putting out, a lot of information for state licensed physicians so they can understand what this means, what factors and conditions are significant when it comes to pilots. And so we're going to be reaching out to trade publications and associations for state licensed physicians, so we make sure that when an airman takes this form into a state licensed physician's office who may not be familiar with aircraft or aeronautical, aeromedical requirements, that they understand what the certification means. And quite honestly, many state licensed physicians make very similar certifications already. For example, many children's schools or sporting events require that the doctor make a similar certification, especially when it comes to things like commercial driver's license. Again, they're making a very similar certification. There's even certain associations out there for certain heavy equipment. A crane operators association, for example, has a similar certification. So this is not something that's foreign to doctors. They just need to make sure they understand what this means for them, and so that that airman can get that checklist signed and move on.
And we've looked at the scuba diving checklist.
Absolutely.
That's a really pretty comprehensive evaluation that goes along with the scuba certification. I mean, it's a multi-page, it's a very intense examination and certification. So this is a little less strenuous probably even than scuba diving.
I think that was Patty that we had looked at.
Right.
Right.
Professional Association Dive Instructors, exactly.
Right. So as you mentioned earlier, and as we talked about a little bit briefly, once that certification is made, we predict that the physician is going to want a copy of this checklist for their records, and they'll keep it with their records. But that form itself, it's going to stay with the airman. No information about the examination is transmitted to the FAA at this point. The airman's going to retain that checklist either with their logbook or wherever they'd like to, or they can keep it in electronic format as long as they can produce it upon a reasonable request by the FAA. That will fulfill their requirements for this medical examination comprehensive checklist. And so let's move on and talk about the medical education course itself, which is the second component after the medical examination checklist. And so the course itself, as I mentioned earlier, AOPA is working on obtaining its final approval from the FAA for our course. It'll be available online on AOPA's website. It's about a 45-minute, an hour-long course. Once you go through it, it's very interactive. There's a lot of videos, a lot of good information in there. and I think we'll touch on some of the exact content in a few moments. But once you go through that course, there will be a brief quiz. I believe it's about 20, 25 questions. You can take it as many times as you need to pass. I believe you can get about three questions wrong, and I think we've all taken it and
failed it. Yeah.
It does happen. It is difficult. It's not something you can brush off. So
And
certainly,
you have to actually watch the course.
yeah, you do. You do. So once you complete that initially, then you will be eligible or qualified to fly under BasicMed. You'll need to repeat that every 24 calendar months, and we'll be able to send airmen, if they so choose, a reminder that they'll get at their email address that says, hey, you need to remember to come on and take that course. And it is something we expect to update. So it's not going to be the same course every 24 months. And I think over time, as we see what issues are really relevant to BasicMed pilots, we'll see the course updated to reflect that information. And I know this is, again, another big point, the FAR 6153, which we'll talk about, which basically prohibits pilots from operating if they know or should know that they have a medical condition that would impact their ability to safely operate an aircraft. There's going to be a lot of focus on that regulation and how to comply with it in this course, which, again, is going to involve a lot of factors like risk mitigation, understanding the perhaps latent side effects of certain medication, and it's really going to focus on having the airmen realize that it's going to be their decision whether they're safe to fly, and if they have questions, they need to interact with their primary care physician. So that's a brief overview of the course itself. Now, when the airman actually goes through the course and completes the quiz successfully, they're going to get presented with a course, well, first they're going to be presented with basically a information collection page. And what this page is going to require is that the airman provides some very basic information. It's going to be the contact information for the airman and the physician. It's also going to be the physician's medical license number. And it's also going to require the airman to provide the date that they had that comprehensive medical examination performed. And so this is an important point in that by the time you're taking the course, you should already have completed the medical examination.
On or after May 1st.
On or after May 1st, which is the current projected target date. The FAA and the other government agencies are telling us they're on track for that. But they have gone as far as to say, and this is from the FAA, that if the course approvals and the forms are out prior to May 1st, we're going to allow airmen to go on, complete the course, get the examination done as well, and then complete the course, and have all that ready to go prior to the May 1st effective date of these regulations. So that's something that they went out of their way to tell us. So that means that hopefully for us that we'll see this material approved prior to May 1st. And we'll talk a little bit more about where we are with the current status towards the end of the conversation here. But so once the airman provides that information, the contact info for themselves, the physician, the medical license number, the date they had the examination performed, they're also going to be required to make a few certifications. And these certifications are, generally speaking, about the airman's fitness to fly, that they know that the checklist was performed by the doctor who administered the examination, that they have no knowledge of any issue that would affect their ability to safely operate an aircraft. So a lot of the same types of certifications that pilots are making every time they're going flying under 6153. There's also going to be a NDR authorization, a National Driver Register authorization, which is going to allow the FAA to conduct a driver's license records check. Very similar, if not exactly the same, as the current NDR authorization that's on the current medical application. And so if an airman had a driver's license suspended or revoked, that's something that the FAA is going to be able to compare information to.
And that NDR, clarify for me, if when the certification is done, that gives the FAA or the DOT a one-time shot at looking at that NDR.
National Driver's Register.
The National Driver Register, just like it does with the medical application now. They can only do that one time per application.
Well, there's different schools of thought on this. I mean, how the process is supposed to work is that the FAA has a list of pilots who have provided this certification on their latest application. So you've got a list of names here, and then they run those names against an NDR search. And what the NDR is what they call a pointer system. And so if a state knows that they have an individual whose driver's license was canceled, suspended, or revoked, all the state does is tell the NDR, and the NDR, if they get a name, they search the name and they say, oh, well, we have a record in the state of, let's say, Pennsylvania that matches the name you just gave us. We don't have any exact information about what happened with that driver's license.
Oh.
You need to go ask the state. But we're at least going to tell you that there might be something there you want to look at that might be relevant to your decision. So again, the FAA is supposed to do that in a timely fashion.
Right.
There's some case law about that as well. But like anything else, airmen who complete this application should be expecting that, look, if there is going to be an issue here, the FAA could very well find out about it through this search. And this checklist is going to be a federal form, just like the current medical application,
Right.
in that you need to make sure that the statements that you're making are true and accurate to the best of your knowledge. And the current existing regulations that concern things like intentional falsification or fraudulent statements are going to apply to this. So
Right.
airmen need to be aware of that when they're filling this form out. Now, this is really the only types of information that are being sent to the FAA, because when the airman completes this medical application course, the course provider, in this case AOPA, is going to transmit that information electronically to the AOPA, to the FAA, and the FAA will process that data on a daily basis.
Right.
And then once that information is transmitted, the airman is going to receive an electronic PDF of a course completion certificate. And just like that examination checklist, the airman can print it off, they can retain it with their logbook or wherever they'd like, or they can keep an electronic copy of that course completion certificate, and they don't have to carry it with them when they're operating, but as long as they can produce it
Right.
upon request by the FAA or another agency, they will be able to comply with the BasicMed rules. So again, not required to carry it with you while you're operating, but something that you are going to be required to complete initially and then every 24 calendar months in order to stay qualified under BasicMed.
Good. All right, let's touch again, and the fact that we're mentioning it a second time is how important we consider this regulation, 6153. That's the regulation dealing with prohibition of operations during medical deficiency, and Jared's alluded to it. If you've ever listened to any of my talks, either at Sun and Fun or Oshkosh, or when we used to do Summit and Expos, I spend a lot of time talking about 6153 because it's the regulation that we abide by every time we get in the airplane. We're making a self-assessment that we are in fact safe and qualified to fly based on our medical condition using the I'm Safe acronym. So BasicMed is just an example of 6153 because it is medical self-assessment, doing what the regulations have required us to do all along. So we're not going to harp on it, but just keep in mind that we got a lot at stake here. This is a big, huge deal, and so pilots typically don't fly when they don't feel well. So we don't expect that to be any different right now. So we're really optimistic that pilots are going to use good judgment, and we're going to find BasicMed to be a very successful new regulation and endeavor into the brave new world we call it. All right, let's talk about where we are now.
Absolutely. So as we've mentioned, the rules found in the new 14 CFR Part 68, new part of the Federal Aviation Regulations, those are published. However, they are not effective until when?
May 1st.
Absolutely. So the forms that we've talked about, the medical examination checklist, as well as the actual medical education course. Again, I can tell you that AOPA's course, we're working on the final approvals from the FAA for that. When it is approved, you'll be able to see that on the FAA's website that it's been approved, and certainly AOPA will be announcing that when it happens. The checklist itself will be available from the FAA. We'll also have a link to it on the FAA's website. Now that both of these forms, I'll call them, because the medical education course contains an information collection form, is what they're known as in federal government terms. Because these forms involve individuals providing information to the federal government, both the checklist and the course information collection form, they have to go through a process where not only the FAA creates and reviews the form, but also goes through the Office of Management and Budget and through a certain required notice and comment periods. And all of these requirements are set either by federal law or regulations and can't be changed. So it has to go through this system, and as soon as they are approved, that's when they'll be available. Now, of course, we've been pushing to make sure that everything comes out on time on May 1st, But of course, we can't make the federal government work any faster than they normally do, which, as we all know, isn't that fast.
Right.
Now, that being said, the FAA has told us that everything is on track to meet the May 1st deadline. And like I said, it's reassuring to me that they went out of their way to say, look, if things are available prior to May 1st,
Right.
you can go ahead and complete it. So hopefully we will see both of these things available prior to the May 1st date. But even if they are out, you can complete them, but you still won't be able to operate under BasicMed until May 1st. So that's the current status of where we're at. And with that,
We've
Ferdi?
got some questions from the audience. Absolutely. Thanks, Jared. First thing I wanted to start with was going on the road. Gary, you mentioned Sun and Fun in Oshkosh. Jared, am I going to see you and Gary out in the field this year?
Oh, I believe you will.
Yeah?
I believe you will.
We're going to be the Bobsey twins of Basic Med for sure. We'll be at Sun and Fun. We'll be doing 2 talks at Sun and Fun in the program tent right next to the AOPA tent. We'll be at Oshkosh.
Yes.
We will be at all 4 regional shows.
Absolutely.
Starting with Camarillo, then Norman, Groton, Connecticut, and Tampa, Florida later on in the year. Not sure the order there, but so yeah, we're going to have this talk down pretty pat here before the end of the year.
And of course, we're always available by telephone as well.
Of course, of course.
What's the charge for autographs, and do you take cash or check or credit card?
We can arrange anything.
Right.
We'll
Very
have Gary's
fluid.
cell phone number available at the end of the presentation, so members will be able to reach him directly.
We'll be tweeting that out, right?
Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right. So this evening, we've gotten a lot of questions coming at it from various angles, some with a correct perspective, some not so much, really wanting us to try to restate and in a complete manner talk more about Safety Pilot. First of all, there's a little bit of a misconception as far as if Basic Med can even be used in a Safety Pilot situation. So can we start there and expand on how it can be used?
Right. So if the individual who's under the hood is acting as PIC, as is most usually the case, the individual who is the safety pilot is acting as a required flight crew member.
Okay.
And because of that, they're not acting as PIC, and therefore Basic Med does not apply.
Right.
Basic Med only applies to those individuals acting as PIC. And that's the limitation. So whether it's for someone operating under the hood for instrument proficiency, or in any other case where you have an aircraft that has required flight crew members, unless you're acting as PIC, Basic Med does not apply to you.
Okay, so are you telling me that that person in the right seat, our observer, the safety pilot, they would need to hold an ordinary
Correct.
Part 67 medical?
They would need to have whatever class of medical certificate is appropriate. They would need to hold an actual FAA-issued medical certificate. And keep in mind, this may tie into a little bit of misconception some people have about safety pilots. Those really only exist under the regulations for that for those individuals flying under the hood. And so what some people may think of safety pilots may not necessarily be the case, and that's a whole other issue. But again, Basic Med only applies to PIC.
Right.
But the pilot who's under the hood, who's the sole manipulator of the controls, can actually log that as PIC time, but can't be acting as PIC.
Right. Yeah, now that takes us into differences between acting and logging
Right,
as PIC, which
right.
we could spend a whole nother.
Well, I only had the question come up today is the reason I raised it, but
Right.
yeah. Now that's not an arbitrary interpretation. That's based on existing Part 61 regulations. So
Right,
it's-
and for example, this may answer another question and something I wanted to touch on as well. When we talked about the Basic Med prohibition on operations for compensation or hire,
Okay.
the exceptions found in 61.113 still apply. And those are the exceptions that basically define a private pilot's certificate's limitations. There's certain things private pilots can do, like operating a flight incidental to their business,
Right.
or charitable flights under 91.146. Things that you could do as a private pilot with a third-class medical certificate, you're still going to be able to do as a private pilot with a Basic Med medical certification
Okay.
or qualification. So that's an important thing to realize as well.
And that's been a really popular question too, and especially when the AC first came out after the announcement of the final rule. So we've fielded that
Yeah.
question a lot.
The charitable piece as well.
Well, that and the
Yeah.
safety pilot.
Right. Even the charitable piece, as far as people wanting to be able to help out in ways that they could as a private pilot with a third-class medical certificate, with the new formulation.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. John Plamondon asks, I applied for a third class and got deferred. My info was sent to FAA. if I get Basic Med before third class is approved, my third class application is approved or denied, will a denial of that third class medical request cancel a Basic Med certification if gotten before denial? I think based on the language, you know where this is
Right.
going.
I have my opinion, but
Well,
go ahead.
let's hear your opinion first. And let's go from there.
I would say you're not going to be able to fly under Basic Med, because once that certificate has been denied,
Right.
then I mean you're not eligible to fly under Basic Med until or unless you can go back to the FAA and get them to reissue it as a special issuance. And that's going to happen because of this processing backlog that the FAA has right now. We're in the midst of that now because of the time frame that we're in. We're getting real close to May 1. So there are people who have applications in the works that will still be in review on May 1.
Right.
So I thought the question was going to be, well, can I fly under Basic Med while my application is
In review.
under review? I would say probably so, because your most recent medical has not been denied.
Right.
And assuming then you get a special issuance out of the FAA, then you're good to go from that point on.
Right. I agree with Gary on this, and I would just go one step further and say I would be very interested to see what the language on the denial letter, if that's what the airman receives, says,
good
because
point.
I think
Right.
we're going to see the FAA maybe change the language that they have on
Right.
that form that says, not only have we found you not eligible to hold a medical certificate, we find you not qualified to operate, under
May very
Part
well.
68,
Right.
and we direct your attention to FAR 6153.
That's right.
And so we may
That's a good
start to
point.
see forms like that as well.
Yeah, we'll be watching for them.
So I think we already
Great question.
answered our next question here then from Bob Kingsley, who asks, I applied for a special issuance and I've been approved over the last 10 years. I won't get my medical back from Oklahoma until after May 1st at this rate though. Can I bypass it and go for the Basic Med?
If you mean bypass as in withdraw that application or just forget that you sent information into the FAA, no, it's not going to work that way. Once the FAA has their hands on your information, they're going to do one of two or three things with it. They're either going to issue you a certificate, they're going to ask you for more information because they can't determine if you're qualified, or they're going to deny it. So there's no withdrawing an application
Right.
at any time.
The gears are in motion.
Right.
Exactly.
And-
Once you've waded into the stream, you can't back
Right.
out.
And just to build on Gary's point there, for those airmen who might have a question about it, an application is considered completed once you not only fill it out online, but then your AME downloads
Correct.
that application when you show up for an appointment. So if that's happened,
Right.
that application has been completed, and if you don't move forward with it, that's going to be considered completed and withdrawn.
Correct.
So that may be the situation some airmen find themselves in.
PPS.
Pilot Protection Services, absolutely. So this is a little vaguer here. Ralph Padilla asks, what if my doctor feels he or she does not want any type of responsibility to sign off on a legal document to avoid being sued, as far as the physician's statement?
Find a doctor that will.
Okay. And on that note, one of our question askers, I think, is in agreement with you. Jeff Ward comments, maybe that person would want to find an occupational health clinic if your regular doc won't sign off. They're the folks who do exams for truck drivers, et cetera, and they're used to this, and we think we've already hit on
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Like we mentioned, these types of certifications are not that unusual for doctors. CDLs, other operators, children for schools and for sporting events, athletes for sporting events. Physicians and practice groups have seen these certifications before. It's something even their medical insurance carriers are familiar with.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that you may have some physicians who aren't comfortable with it, or practice groups that say, no, we don't want anyone signing this. But like Gary mentioned, there's going to be plenty of other doctors out there, whether it's an urgent care or an occupational physician. And then at the end of the day, you still have AMEs, and they are going to be applying Part 68 requirements, not Part 67.
And we've talked to a number of AMEs who have expressed interest in playing in Basic Med. So I think we'll see some support among the AME community. But there'll be docs out there that'll do these certifications. So we got to find out where they are, but they're going to be there.
Okay, great. QTET1 asks, do all existing pilots need to go to Basic Med, or can they still do it the old-fashioned way?
Great question.
Absolutely.
Third class medical is not going away. The FAA, and you tell me if I'm correct, the FAA defines Basic Med as an alternative
medical certification
medical
standard,
certification
basically.
standard. Excellent. So for pilots that look at Basic Med and they say, you know, it's not that big a deal to me. I might as well just keep going to my AME for a third class medical. There's no problem with that at all. They can absolutely do that.
Absolutely. All the medical classes are still there. Sport pilot, still there. If
Right.
you want to continue flying under sport pilot, you are absolutely able to do that. No change.
You got ahead of me there, exactly. We've had people contact us under the misconception that sport pilot is going away and it's being replaced by Basic Med. Or third class medical certificates ordinarily issued under Part 67 are
Right.
being replaced by Basic Med. And neither of those are true. We really have, you might think of it as 3 different ecosystems that we're about to come up with. Right?
Absolutely, and you know, I'll just mention this since some pilots may fall into this. You can actually do both. You can
You're getting
still
ahead of me.
continue to hold your first, second, third class medical certificate and get qualified under Basic Med. Now, what's interesting there is that the FAA has said that when you're making that flight, you need to choose prior to that flight which one you're going to be operating under.
Right.
Are you going to be operating under
Right.
your medical certificate, or are you going to be operating under Basic Med? Because if you're flying under Basic Med, then your whole flight needs to comply with those flight condition limitations, the 18,000 feet,
Right.
the 250 knots indicated. You can't change your mind midair. At least that's the position the FAA is taking at this point in time. So absolutely, you could hold both.
Right. Let's see. So Pete asks, my third class medical is good until December of next year, 2018. If I complete the Basic Med requirements and medical exam now, is my current valid Class 3 medical now void?
No, absolutely not. It is valid until, you know, under 61.23, the duration requirements for certificates. It's not otherwise changed by his completion of the Basic Med course or checklist. It's still a valid certificate.
It's just that I have to decide
And
when I go to fly.
absolutely, and the FAA has said that if you are flying under Basic Med, you're not exercising the privileges of your medical certificate. But at the same time, you know, if, for example, something were to happen and they find out that you had a medical condition, they could still take an action to
Right.
suspend or revoke that
Right.
medical, more likely revoke it.
Good point.
And then now not only have you lost your medical, but your most recent medical certificate has been denied, which now makes you ineligible for Basic Med.
Right.
So that does create some issues, and so you have to keep in mind that the medical requirements are going to not only affect your eligibility for Basic Med, but also that certificate as well.
So the FAA still has leverage.
They do. They
Right.
do.
Right.
And I'll just raise a sticky point because there's been some discussion about the possibility of a pilot who wants to fly under Basic Med who has an unexpired third class medical voluntarily surrendering the third class medical certificate to avoid.
That's been discussed as an option. There are some pilots who are very ready to do that. I would just caution them that, number one, just because you're trying to surrender a certificate doesn't mean the FAA is obligated to accept it.
as bizarre as that sounds.
As bizarre as that sounds. And number two, again, we haven't seen this specifically, but I would be concerned as to what the FAA might do if they see
Right.
you trying to hand over the certificate. Maybe nothing. Maybe they send a request for
Right.
additional information,
Raise
which
an eyebrow,
they can
basically.
do under Part 67 and Part 68
Correct.
if they
Correct.
have a reasonable basis to do so. So again, I wouldn't encourage a pilot to do that without really getting a full understanding of what the possible outcomes may be.
And
Right.
how might they do that, Jared?
They can call us, they can call Gary, and they will get in
They
touch.
can call Jerry.
They can call me. And they will get a full understanding from both the medical and the legal side as to what the
And that's a great point. Sometimes, even though we work very closely together with the legal group, sometimes from a certification standpoint, medical certification, and a legal standpoint, we may not necessarily be telling the member the very same thing.
absolutely.
And that can sometimes get a little complicated, but it depends on, it depends on whether you're a lawyer or a medical type.
Absolutely, and to just build on that a little bit, when Gary is trying to help an airman through the medical certification process, usually cooperation with the FAA is the name of the game there. Oftentimes when it's a legal matter,
Right.
you may already be beyond the point of cooperation, and we want to put you in the best position that you need to be in to take on a fight with the FAA.
And just through incidental conversations with you, just out of my own curiosity, I've found over time that it is surprising what the implications are of performing such simple steps as providing information or surrendering a certificate that you think you can then get back later. The implications on where the onus might move.
Absolutely,
For
and
example.
I will say that when you get any sort of information collection request from the FAA these days, they're including the Pilot's Bill of Rights notification, and that's a very important thing for pilots to pay attention to, because that basically lays out for you that any information you provide to the FAA could be used against you, and as you well know, sometimes it is.
It is, yeah.
So pilots do need to be careful when they receive those types of requests.
All right, we're almost at the end of our program here and the end of our question list. Idaho Joe says, you do bring up an interesting question. Is it okay if an MD signs off when in reality his physician's assistant does the exam?
That is addressed, I believe, in the advisory circular.
Absolutely, a
Physician extender,
Yeah.
that's the term. And the FAA is okay with that as long as it's the physician that signs the declaration. The physician extender can do the examination.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as the MD's or the doctor's signature is on it, that's okay. That was a good question that we had questions about before the AC came out. Again, great information in the advisory circular.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's actually one that on our FAQs on the Fit to Fly resources on AOPA's website, we know the FAA looks at those. They actually send us some updates now and then, and I believe that was actually one of them
Yeah,
that they pointed out that said, hey,
that's
look,
right.
we're going to say that these physician extenders can actually perform the exam, but the doctor still has to sign off on it.
So the understudy can perform the exam, and the master can sign it off, not only in the doctor's office, but also in the mechanic when it comes to A&Ps and their assistants on the aircraft.
Yep.
So there's
Yes,
a
sir.
parallel there. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay. Finally, let's round it off with a little more on medications, if we could. Paul G asks, are the FAA medications list the same? And I think what he's really getting at there is, if I can fly or can't fly on a certain medication under 67, is there an exact list, an equivalent list, or a similar list, or a no list under Part 68 for BasicMed? How do they relate?
On the subject of medications, there is only one regulation, well, there's two, but primarily one, 9117, I believe it is, that prohibits the use of any medication that adversely affects the pilot's faculties in any way contrary to safety. The FAA, being the policymakers that they are, chose to expand upon that and create a list of medications that used to be not even published. They now publish a partial list. It's called the Do Not Issue, Do Not Fly list in the Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners. And that list is more a grouping of different types of drugs that the FAA would consider inappropriate for aviation activities. Now, we have put together an unofficial medications database that we've been building since about 2001. And it's a pretty comprehensive list of medications that are both allowed or not allowed, and in some cases we provide an explanation about why the medication is not allowed. But the FAA has been hounded for years to provide an actual list of the medications that they don't allow, and they have, for good reason, have chosen not to do that because it's a dynamic process. Some medications may not be allowed when they first come out, but after a track record is established, after they've been FDA approved, the FAA can determine that maybe this drug is safe to fly with after all. Sometimes drugs are used off-label initially and then get FDA approval for that off-label use later on.
Yep.
So it's a real dynamic field, and the FAA really doesn't want to get in the business of getting in the FDA's business, the Food and Drug Administration. So they have their own established policy with respect to impact of aviation safety on certain medications usage. But the best source to go, if you don't want to go to the FAA website, is take a look at our medications database on our AOPA website.
And how to get there, actually, I just brought it up. You can head over to our website at www.aopa.org. In the top navigation, you can hover over Go Fly, and in that menu, you'll find a second entry is Medical Resources. And under that Go Fly Medical Resources area, on that next page, the first thing you'll see is someone holding an iPad, and it says FAA allowed, not allowed medications for flight. So I wanted to bring up that specific route on how to get to that page right now, because many of you have been asking about the medications and specifically the medication list. So www.aopa.org, hover over Go Fly, click on Medical Resources, and then on the next page, the first story is our medications database. Well, guys, that's the end of our questions. Thank you so much for all that information. I hope you had as good a time as I did, and
It's been a blast.
it has been.
Absolutely.
And as time goes on and we develop a deeper understanding of what BasicMed is and what it means to you. And as the process continues in Washington and Oklahoma City for getting those darn forms finally out the door and in our hands, and once our May 1st deadline gets here, when we can start to use them, we'll be out in the field and continuing to help educate and answer members' questions and make sure that you can fly in the safest and healthiest way that everyone knows how. All right?
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, and to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us as well. If you do have any aviation-related questions, please feel free to give us a call as part of your membership here at 1-800-USA-AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. Or you can email your questions to us at pilotassist@aopa.org. And don't forget to check out all of our website assets at www.aopa.org, as well as the pilot protection website at www.aopa.org/PPS. Thanks for joining us.
See ya.
Thanks.
Didn't suck too bad.